Episode 20, The Trust as a Long-Term Institution, Stewardship, Legacy, and Time. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fellen. Welcome to Trusts Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain terms how trusts actually work in real families. For the last 20 years, I've worked as a fiduciary focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance. Not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. In this role, I've advised hundreds of families, as well as institutions and advisors across the world. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. I've recently completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of both the fiduciary and private banking fields. Before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for general information and discussion only. It does not constitute legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. As ever, you should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. So let's begin. Well, here we are, our last episode of this series. Over the course of it, we've examined trusts from many human angles: legal structure, roles and powers, governance, psychology, failure, regulation. But today is different. Today is about time. Not tax years or reporting cycles, but decades, generations, and responsibility across lives that overlap only briefly. This session reframes the trust not as a planning tool, but as a long-term institution. That change in perspective alters everything. You see, most trusts are created in a planning mindset, an upcoming liquidity event, a solution for family imbalance, a response to a moment in time. Now, that mindset is understandable, but it is incomplete. Planning assumes a problem to be solved. Institutions assume continuity to be managed. Trusts that are treated purely as planning devices tend to age badly. They become rigid, ossified. They drift from their purpose. They struggle to adapt as people and circumstances change. The longer a trust is expected to last, the less helpful a short-term planning mindset becomes. You see, the trust is an institution, and an institution is defined by three things: purpose, continuity, and stewardship. A trust, properly understood, has all three. Its purpose is set at creation, but interpreted over time. Its continuity depends on governance rather than individuals. Its stewardship rests with trustees who hold responsibility, but not entitlement. Seen this way, a trust begins to resemble other enduring institutions: universities, foundations, endowments. Now, none of these exist to optimize. They exist to endure. And that shift in framing changes how decisions are made. First of all, we have to look at stewardship versus ownership. Ownership is about rights. Stewardship is about obligation. Trust law deliberately separates the two. Trustees own, but do not benefit. Beneficiaries benefit, but do not own. This arrangement is not accidental. It is highly ethical. Stewardship asks trustees to act for people that they may never meet, in circumstances they cannot fully predict, with information that will always be incomplete. This requires restraint. The best trustees think in terms of preservation of purpose, not maximization of outcome. That is a fundamentally different mindset. Legacy is often misunderstood. It is confused with control after death, or with reputation, or with permanence of instruction. But in reality, legacy is influence without command. A trust allows values to be expressed, not enforced, guided, not guaranteed. And this is why humility matters at the point of creation. Settlers who accept that future generations may interpret intent through their own context create resilient institutions, whereas those who try to dictate outcomes across time create fragility. Legacy survives best when it is light enough to travel. Now, time is the most underestimated risk in trust planning. Not market risk, not tax risk. Time. People change. Families fragment and reform. Societies shift. Regulation tightens. A trust that cannot adapt will eventually fail, even if it was perfectly designed at the outset. Long-term institutions survive by embedding principles rather than rules, discretion, review, governance, judgment. These are not technical features, they are survival mechanisms. So what is the role of advisors and trustees over time? In a long-term institution, advisors and trustees become custodians of continuity. Their role is not to preserve the past, but it is to carry the purpose forward. Now that requires courage, to say no when pressure builds, to adapt the structures without abandoning intent, to recognize when change strengthens rather than weakens the institution. Competence here is measured over decades, not transactions. So let me give you an example from my book, Trust, The Skill of Trusteeship and 16 Success Stories and 1 Failure, when trusteeship stopped being about planning and became about presence. And this is perhaps the most personal story from that book. Because you see, a few years ago, a client and a very close friend called me while I was walking through an airport. His voice was unsteady, the kind of voice that tells you immediately that what follows is not technical. The fact was that his young daughter had just been diagnosed that morning with ALS, a condition that does not negotiate, does not reverse, and does not hurry for anyone's readiness. In that conversation, on that airport concourse, he didn't ask me about tax, structure, or efficiency. He simply asked me whether it was still possible to make sure that she would be cared for properly, discreetly, dignified, without chaos. What followed was not careful planning, and definitely not clever. It was careful listening. Yes, we built a trust, but the most important decisions were not about jurisdiction or optimization. They were about tone, about making sure that there would be no scrambling later, no emergency meetings, no arguments about funding, when energy and attention would be needed elsewhere. The trust was designed to adapt as her needs changed, guided by a medical reality rather than administrative triggers. As her condition progressed, the trust did exactly what it was meant to do. Nothing dramatic, no headlines. The care increased smoothly. Specialists were added, her home was adapted, therapy shifted from ambition to comfort. Decisions were made early so that no one had to decide anything in a crisis. What struck me most was how little the trust intruded. It didn't impose itself on her life. It receded, allowing her parents to be parents, her carers to be carers, and most importantly, for her to remain herself for as long as possible. That absence of noise was not accidental. It was deliberate. There was no illusion that the trust could fix anything. It could definitely not cure her. It couldn't slow the disease. But what it could do was remove friction. It could ensure that dignity was never compromised by delay, confusion, or dispute. It could honor intent when physical strength was fading. This is where humility matters. As trustees, there was nothing to optimize, only something to protect. The temptation to be seen as decisive or impressive had simply no place here. What mattered was restraint, listening, accepting that the role was not to lead the story, but to support it. Years later, the trust continues to operate smoothly. Reviews are held, care evolves. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels performative. The structure does not draw attention to itself. And that's perhaps precisely why it works. This case has taught me something fundamental about long-term trusteeship. Some trusts exist to grow wealth, others exist to carry meaning. In both cases, humility is what allows a structure to endure without distorting what it was meant to serve. If trusteeship is stewardship across time, then humility is the posture that makes that stewardship possible. Not cleverness, not control. Just the discipline to stand slightly to the side and do the work properly, even when no one is watching. That is what allows a trust to become an institution rather than an intervention. Let's talk about amnesia. One of the least discussed risks in long-term trust is amnesia. Now, of course, I'm not talking about legal failure, not market collapse. I'm talking about forgetting. Institutions fail when they forget why they exist. In the first generation, normally purpose is vivid and colourful. The founder remembers the origin of wealth. He remembers when he didn't have any wealth. He remembers the early struggle, the trade-offs, the sacrifices. The trust is created in response to something concrete, business built, family protected, a risk mitigated. By the second generation, that origin begins to soften. The trust is familiar by now. It is present, but no longer questioned. Its distributions feel, well, routine. Its governance rhythm becomes perhaps slightly procedural. By the third generation, memory has been replaced by assumption. The trust exists. It has always existed. It feels less like a deliberate structure and more like a natural condition. This is where institutional decline begins. When purpose fades, entitlement fills the space. A long-term trust must therefore cultivate memory deliberately. I'm not talking nostalgia here. I'm not talking myth-making, but clarity. Why was this trust established? What risk was it designed to manage? What value was it intended to preserve? What behavior was it meant to encourage? These questions aren't sentimental. They are structural. Without a shared memory, trustees cannot exercise judgment in alignment with intent. Institutional memory must be refreshed, retold, and, occasionally, corrected. That requires documentation, letters of wishes revisited, governance reviews recorded, conversations minuted, not merely for compliance, but for continuity. An institution that forgets its origin loses its center of gravity. Adaptation is necessary. Drift is dangerous. The two are easily confused. Adaptation means adjusting mechanisms while preserving purpose. Drift means adjusting purpose, but without noticing. Over decades, small decisions accumulate. A distribution here to ease tension, a policy softened to avoid conflict, a governance clause bypassed there because everyone agrees. None of these actions appear decisive, but together they redefine the trust. The trustees who manage long-lived institutions understand that flexibility must be anchored. They allow structures to evolve, but they insist on articulating why change strengthens rather than weakens alignment. This requires a discipline that is rarely visible from outside. It means occasionally resisting pressure that appears reasonable. It means documenting reasoning clearly. It means accepting short-term discomfort to preserve long-term coherence. Adaptation without principle becomes erosion, but rigidity without adaptation becomes irrelevance. The art of trusteeship lies somewhere between these two failures. I'd like to focus now on legitimacy. A trust that lasts must feel legitimate to each generation that it serves. Legal validity is not enough. Emotional legitimacy matters. Beneficiaries who feel excluded from understanding, even if excluded from control, eventually disengage or resist. They begin to see the trust as an obstacle rather than a support. Legitimacy is built through explanation, through transparency of process, through education, not by surrendering authority, but by clarifying it. Trustees who endure across generations invest time in conversation long before conflict arises. They explain discretion, they explain constraints, they explain why equality is not always a question of fairness, and why patience is sometimes a protection. When beneficiaries understand the philosophy of the trust, even decisions that they dislike can feel coherent. When they do not, even generous outcomes feel arbitrary. Institutional authority rests less on power than on credibility, and credibility is cumulative. Long-term institutions develop rhythm. Universities have academic calendars, endowments have investment cycles, courts have procedural timetables, and trusts require rhythm too. Regular trustee meetings, periodic governance reviews, investment oversight, beneficiary communication, not because crisis demands it, but because continuity does. Rhythm prevents both neglect and overreaction. It allows small adjustments before structural failure develops. It creates a predictable framework within which discretion can operate calmly. Trusts without rhythm tend to oscillate. Long periods of calm followed by short periods of urgent intervention. Silence followed by an abrupt change. That pattern weakens confidence and weakens the trust. Measured review strengthens it. An institution that reviews itself regularly signals seriousness. It signals that the endurance is deliberate. But there is a moral dimension to long-term trusteeship that is often understated. When a trust is designed to endure beyond the lifetimes of its creators, it implicitly claims authority over future resources and behavior. That authority must be exercised, but with restraint. Trustees must remain aware that they are shaping conditions for people who are not yet born. Their decisions influence their opportunity, their expectations, and even their character. Too much generosity can erode initiative. Too much restriction can erode autonomy. Too much control can stifle development. Too little oversight can invite fragility. This balance can't be codified fully in drafting. It requires judgment, renewed, repeated. The longer the time horizon, the greater the moral burden. A trust is not merely a container of assets. It is a structure that influences human development. Recognizing this tempers arrogance. Now, we've talked about failure in this podcast series, but we haven't talked about when trusts end. Not all trusts should last forever. That's rarely said clearly enough. Some trusts simply complete their purpose. A business is sold, a generation stabilizes, a risk dissipates. In such cases, continuation may no longer serve coherence. Ending a trust can also be an act of stewardship rather than failure. But the decision must be deliberate. Trustees must ask whether continuity still serves purpose or whether inertia has replaced intent. Institutions that endure well are those that periodically test their own necessity for existence. Longevity is not a virtue in itself. It is meaningful only when aligned with relevance. When that happens, one asks oneself, well, what do the trustees leave behind? Trustees often focus on what they administer. Less attention is paid to what they leave. A trustee who serves faithfully for decades shapes more than distribution. They shape culture. They shape how beneficiaries think about responsibility, about risk, about patience, about governance. When trustees change, culture either transfers or fractures. That is why trustee succession is institutional succession. New trustees must understand not only the trustee, but the interpretive history, the reasoning behind past decisions, the tensions previously navigated. Without that continuity, the institution resets unintentionally with each appointment. The best long-term trusts invest in transition deliberately. Outgoing trustees explain, incoming trustees listen. Records are not merely achieved, they are interpreted. The best long-term trusts invest in transition deliberately. Outgoing trustees explain, incoming trustees listen. Records are not merely archived, they are interpreted. This continuity transforms a series of appointments into an enduring office. Ultimately, a trust as a long-term institution depends less on drafting than on character. Competence matters, technical understanding matters, regulatory awareness matters, but character matters more. Patience, independence, proportion, the ability to tolerate pressure without collapsing into haste, the discipline to say no softly, the humility to admit uncertainty, the courage to adapt when circumstances change. Over decades, these traits determine whether the trust remains coherent. Institutions fail slowly before they fail suddenly. Character is what slows that drift. We began this episode by reframing the trust as an institution rather than a planning tool. That shifts, moves the focus from transaction to continuity, from efficiency to legitimacy, from control to stewardship, from the founder's intention to the family's evolving reality, from the present moment to time itself. A trust that understands itself as an institution behaves differently. It tolerates discomfort more easily. It resists panic more effectively. It invests in governance even when nothing appears wrong. It speaks clearly about purpose, even when purpose feels obvious. Most importantly, it accepts that endurance is not automatic. It is maintained. One of the tacit paradoxes of long-term trusts is this: they are created to endure, yet nothing around them does. Families change, wealth changes, law changes, even the moral assumption of society changes. And yet, the trust remains. This endurance can create an illusion of permanence. Beneficiaries begin to assume that the structure is immovable. Trustees begin to assume its authority is self-sustaining. Advisors begin to treat it as background rather than architecture. That is when fragility can set in. Institutions that last are not permanent. They are maintained. They survive not because they are indestructible, but because they are reviewed, renewed, and occasionally corrected. The danger is not collapse, it is complacency. A trust that has functioned smoothly for 20 years may be more at risk than one that has faced periodic challenge. Calm can conceal drift. Success can conceal weakening alignment. This is why long-term trustees must resist the comfort of routine. Trust should feel stable. It should not feel unquestioned. There is a difference. Another distinctive feature of a trust as an institution is that its authority is often invisible. Unlike a board of directors or a court, trustees rarely operate in public view. Their decisions are usually private. Their reasoning is often highly confidential. Their accountability is formal rather than theatrical. This invisibility is both a strength and a risk. It is a strength because it allows discretion to operate without spectacle. Family matters can be resolved smoothly. Tensions can be managed without reputational escalation. But it is a risk because invisible authority can easily be misunderstood. Beneficiaries may see only outcomes, not process. They may assume arbitrariness where there is careful reasoning. They may interpret restraint as indifference. Long-term trusteeship, therefore, requires calibrated visibility, not exposure, not justification of every decision, but enough explanation to sustain confidence. A trust that hides too much erodes trust in the human sense of the word. An institution that communicates nothing eventually communicates indifference. The balance is subtle. It must be recalibrated across generations. What felt appropriately private in one area may feel opaque in another. Again, time is a variable. When trusts endure for decades, wealth itself changes in character. The original assets may have been entrepreneurial, illiquid, concentrated, closely managed. Later generations may inherit diversified equity portfolios, passive investments, institutional custody. The trust's relationship to wealth evolves. In the early years, trustees may be guardians of risk. In later years, they may be stewards of abundance. These are entirely different disciplines. Guardianship of risk demands caution and preservation. Stewardship of abundance demands proportion and distribution policy. If trustees continue to operate with the psychology of scarcity, long after scarcity has passed, resentment builds. If they operate with the psychology of abundance before stability exists, fragility emerges. Long-term institutions must recalibrate their wealth narrative consciously. Is the trust preserving, growing, distributing, stabilizing, transitioning? Without this clarity, behavior defaults to habit, and habit across decades becomes distortion. In short-term planning, saying no is often tactical. In long-term institutions, saying no is cultural. Trustees will face pressure for accelerated distributions, for preferential treatment, for structural amendments that favor one branch over another, for investment decisions driven by enthusiasm rather than prudence. Each individual request may appear manageable, but the cumulative effect of small concessions reshapes institutional character entirely. Saying no calmly and consistently is not obstruction, it is boundary maintenance. Over time, beneficiaries learn what the trust will and will not do. Predictability replaces negotiation. This isn't rigidity. Trustees should adapt where principle allows, but adaptation must be deliberate, not under pressure. Institutions that cannot say no lapse. Once their shape is lost, legitimacy follows. Now, I find that crisis can be an amazing clarifier. Long-term trusts inevitably face crisis: a market collapse, a family dispute, a regulatory shift, a sudden death, a liquidity event. In those moments, the true quality of the institution becomes visible, not in the drafting, not in the asset allocation, in behavior. Do trustees revert to process calmly, or do they improvise under pressure? Do beneficiaries respect decisions even if they disagree, or do they escalate conflict? Does prior communication provide context, or does misunderstanding multiply? Crisis does not create institutional character, it reveals it. This is why preparation during calm periods matters so much. Governance rehearsed calmly becomes resilience when tension rises. Institutions strengthened in calm endure crisis with proportion. Those neglected in calm often fracture under strain. Let's look at the big picture. Let's look at society and societal change. Over multiple decades, a trust will encounter social shifts that its founder could not have anticipated. Changes in family structure, attitudes to equality, expectations around transparency, regulatory scrutiny, public perception of wealth. What was once considered prudent privacy may later be interpreted as secrecy. What was once viewed as progressive may later feel restrictive. Trustees must navigate these shifts without abandoning purpose, and this requires interpretive skill. A long-term institution must distinguish between core principles and contextual assumptions, between enduring values and period-specific preferences. For example, a trust created in an era of strong patriarchal norms may need to reconsider governance mechanisms to ensure legitimacy in a more egalitarian context. Failure to adapt can alienate future generations. Unanchored adaptation can dilute intent. The trustee's task is not to preserve history unchanged. It is to carry purpose across eras without distortion. That is more demanding than static preservation. There is another dimension that rarely appears in drafting: emotional fatigue. Believe me, serving as trustee over decades is not merely technical work. It is relational work. It involves absorbing tension repeatedly, navigating disappointment, holding boundaries that, I assure you, are not always welcomed. Over time, trustees can become cautious to the point of withdrawal, or hardened to the point of rigidity. Institutional continuity, therefore, requires renewal, not only of structure, but, to be honest, of energy. Trustees must examine themselves periodically. Am I still independent? Am I still engaged? Am I still listening? Have I become procedural rather than thoughtful? An institution can decay internally even while appearing stable externally. Self-review is as important as structural review. Now let's look at time horizons and investment philosophy. Investment policy in long-term trusts is often, mechanical. Asset allocation models, risk parameters, performance benchmarks. These are all necessary, but in a multi-generational context, they must be anchored in purpose. What is the time horizon, truly? If the trust is designed to endure indefinitely, then short-term volatility may matter less than governance stability. If the trust anticipates eventual termination or a staged distribution, then liquidity planning becomes central. Too often, investment philosophy drifts into imitation of institutional endowments without reflection on family reality. An endowment serves a public mission. A family trust serves individuals whose expectations evolve. The investment strategy must therefore reflect not only financial theory, but behavioural context. This alignment is rarely static. It must be revisited as beneficiaries age, as family circumstances change, as distributions shift, as liquidity events occur. Time changes risk appetite. Institutions that fail to recalibrate investment philosophy risk either excessive conservatism or unnecessary volatility. Now, during this podcast series, I've talked a lot about documentation, and I hesitate to talk about it again. But I want to talk about its power. Over decades, documentation becomes memory. We know that. Minutes that explain reasoning, letters of wishes that are updated thoughtfully, governance reviews that record dissent as well as consensus. We also know that these records are not bureaucratic clutter. They are institutional continuity. Future trustees will rely on them. Courts may rely on them. Beneficiaries may draw reassurance from them. A trust without documentation is vulnerable to reinterpretation. Memory fades, records stabilize. But documentation must capture reasoning, not merely outcomes. It is not enough to record that a distribution was made. The reasoning behind it must be articulated. That narrative continuity is what allows a trust to endure across transitions. Let's talk about trusteeship and mortality. Every trustee will eventually leave office, retirement, resignation, even death. The trust continues. This is perhaps the clearest expression of institutional character. The role outlives the individual. Trustees who understand this behave differently. They avoid personalizing authority. They avoid shaping structures around their own preferences alone. They invest in succession. The institution must not depend on personality. And yet, personality inevitably shapes it. The discipline is to leave the trust stronger than one found it, clearer, more coherent, better documented, more understood. That is stewardship measured not in distributions, but in durability. If there is one single thread that runs through this entire episode, and perhaps indeed this series, it is restraint. Not passivity, not hesitation, restraint. The recognition that power exercised across generations must be careful. The acceptance that wealth does not eliminate tension, it amplifies it. The understanding that structures do not solve human complexity, they merely channel it. A trust, seen as a long-term institution, is a discipline imposed voluntarily across time. It says we will not allow immediacy to dominate continuity. We will not allow personality to override principle. We will not allow silence to replace explanation. This discipline is a discreet one. It rarely attracts admiration. It's not glamorous, but it endures. And endurance, in the context of families and wealth, is rarer than performance. As I bring this final episode to a close, let's distill the central lessons. Across this series, we've examined trusts from many angles: structure, discretion, governance, psychology, failure, business ownership, succession, exit, regulation. But if this final session has done anything, it has reframed all of those topics through a single lens: time. Not the time of reporting deadlines or tax years, but generational time, the slow movement of families, the drift of memory, the silent accumulation of decisions that shape institutions. So what has this episode taught us? First, a trust must be understood not as a transaction, but as an institution. Planning solves problems. Institutions manage continuity. When a trust is treated merely as a planning device, it ages poorly. When it is treated as a long-term institution, it develops rhythm, legitimacy, resilience. Second, purpose must be preserved, not fossilized. The founding intent of a trust matters, but intent cannot be frozen. It must be interpreted across changing circumstances. Trustees are not archivists. They are stewards. Their task is not to replicate the founder's moment, but to carry the underlying purpose forward without distortion. Third, stewardship is different from ownership. Trustees hold legal title but not entitlement. Beneficiaries receive benefit but not control. That separation is deliberate. It imposes responsibility where power exists. It imposes restraint where discretion operates. It asks trustees to act for people that they may never meet, in conditions that they cannot fully predict. This is not technical work. It is ethical work. Fourth, humility is essential. Legacy is not control beyond the grave. It is influence without command. The most resilient trusts are created by settlers who accept that future generations will think differently, live differently, and interpret differently. Fifth, time is the central risk factor. Markets fluctuate, regulation tightens, families change, expectations evolve. A trust that cannot adapt will fail eventually, no matter how elegant its drafting at inception. Long-term resilience comes not from rigid rules, but from embedded principles: discretion, review, governance, judgment. These are indeed survival mechanisms. Sixth, institutional memory must be cultivated deliberately. Purpose fades if it is not restated. Origin stories soften. Assumptions replace understanding. When memory declines, entitlement rises. Seventh, adaptation must not become erosion. Small compromises accumulate. Informal arrangements harden into precedent. Pressure reshapes behavior. Trustees must distinguish between necessary evolution and general dilution. Eighth, legitimacy matters as much as legality. A trust can be legally sound and emotionally fragile. Beneficiaries who do not understand the structure may resent it. Ninth, rhythm prevents both neglect and panic. Regular meetings, periodic reviews, structured communication. These habits are not bureaucratic exercises. They are stabilizing forces. 10th, trusteeship carries a moral weight. A long-term trust shapes opportunity for people not yet born. It influences incentives, expectations, and behavior. 11th, institutions must occasionally test their own relevance. Not all trusts should endure indefinitely. Some complete their purpose. Ending a trust can be an act of stewardship rather than an act of failure. 12th, trustee succession is institutional succession. Trustees define ownership culture. When they change, continuity must be managed deliberately. Documentation, explanation, and transition matter. 13th, character sustains structure. Technical competence is necessary, but over decades, character determines resilience, patience, independence, proportion, the discipline to say no, the courage to adapt, the humility to admit uncertainty. Institutions decay slowly before they fail suddenly. Character slows that decay. And finally, restraint is the simple thread that holds everything together. Restraint in drafting, restraint in distribution, restraint in control, restraint in reaction. A trust does not eliminate tension, it channels it. It does not remove conflict, it structures it. It does not guarantee harmony, it preserves coherence. As we conclude this series, the essential lesson is simple. Trusts endure not because they're clever, but because they are stewarded. They survive not because they avoid difficulty, but because they normalize it. They matter not because they optimize outcomes in every moment, but because they preserve coherence across generations. That is stewardship. That is legacy. And that is time understood properly. And that was the trust as a long-term institution unpacked. I hope that you've enjoyed this series of podcasts as much as I have enjoyed writing them. Unpacking them for you did exactly the same for me, allowing me to return to basics, to simplify, and to concentrate complex concepts, and thereby make them all the more clear to me. I leave this podcast series strengthened as a fiduciary, and more convinced than ever of the power of fiduciary work in preserving human intention across time and geographies. I hope that you feel the same. Until next time, I am Alexander von der Fell.